So I'm skipping to the last passage in John today because I'm finishing out the sermon series in John. Pastor Brian's going to want to start a new sermon series in September. I think he's going to be going through 1 Peter. And so we're going to look at Jesus' final words to primarily Peter in this passage. I'll be preaching my last sermon next Sunday here at the church. And I'm going to talk on one of the key elements or keys to living the Christian life, and you'll have to come next week to find out what that is. So, in this passage, Jesus is going to teach us what we need to know about being a shepherd. Now, I don't want you to think that this is just for pastors and church leaders, because every Christian at some point in their life is called to shepherd God's people. Now, if you're a parent, that's certainly true. You're a shepherd of your children. If you're involved in any kind of ministry at all, you're going to at some point be shepherding people. And if you're not involved in any kind of ministry, why aren't you? Because everyone is called to serve and minister in God's church. And so this information is not just relevant for me or for church leaders, it's really relevant for everyone. And I want you to listen to what the Lord wants to say to you in it. So I'm going to invite you to turn in John chapter 21, verses 15 through 25. John is the fourth book in the New Testament. As you're turning there, this is one of Jesus' conversations with his disciples after he rose from the dead. One of many conversations he has, and this is primarily a conversation with Peter. We're going to start in verses 15 through 17. We're going to learn what we need to know to be a shepherd, and the first thing that we're going to learn in these verses is you need to love Jesus to take care of his sheep. So let's look at verses 15 through 17. So when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my lambs," or feed my lambs. He said to him again a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Shepherd my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." Now, before we look at Jesus' words and talk about what's going on here, you need to remember that this conversation is in the context of Peter just having experienced a colossal fail in his life. He had denied Jesus 3 times. It's no coincidence now that Jesus asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" This is probably a deliberate reminder to Peter of his failure to love Jesus in the past. So that's the context of this conversation. Jesus begins by asking him about, "Do you love me?" And at this point, I want to let you know something that's going on with the word love in this passage. There's 2 different Greek words for love that are found in this passage. There's the word phileo, which means brotherly love or affection or love for a friend. That's the word that Peter uses throughout this conversation. And then there's the word agapao, or agape, you may know the noun form, which is sacrificial love. It is the love that God has for his church. It's the love that I'm willing to die for you kind of love. That's the word that Jesus uses twice in this conversation. The other thing that is going on here, you may notice that Jesus refers to Peter as Simon throughout this conversation. Simon was his name before Jesus renamed him Peter. So what's going on here? I suspect what's happened here is that recently Peter, whose name means rock, had not really acted much like a rock. And so Jesus goes back to his name, Simon. It's almost as if he's saying to Peter, Peter, are you willing to live up to the name of rock or not? And I think that's why he addresses him as Simon instead of Peter. So he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Well, what are the these that he's referring to? Now, some commentators think Jesus was referring to Peter's fishing gear, which he had just used previously to catch fish, so the boat and the nets and stuff, and that what Jesus was really asking Peter is, do you love me more than your former profession? I don't really think that's what's going on here. I think because Jesus uses the noun agapao, do you sacrificially love me, that what Jesus is really doing is asking Peter, do you love me more than these, your fellow disciples? Now, why would he do that? Well, it's because Peter himself had claimed to love Jesus sacrificially more than the other disciples. His exact words are listed there on your sermon notes if you want to look at that. Now, before Jesus was arrested, Peter said to him, even though all may fall away because of you, I will never fall away. You know what he's in essence saying? I will sacrificially love you even if the rest of these guys don't. Even if all of them fall away from you, I will stick with you. That's what Peter claimed to Jesus. Now, I think Peter truly believed that in the moment. I think that was his intention, to sacrificially love Jesus even unto death if necessary. But in the cold dark of the night that Jesus was arrested, and in the morning after, Peter failed. He denied Jesus 3 times. And so when Peter responds to Jesus' question, do you agapao me, do you sacrificially love me? Peter says, yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you. You know that I have a fond affection for you, that I love you like a brother. I see in Peter's response there a certain level of humility that had not been there before. He's become chastened and humbled by his failure. And he now knows what it means to sacrificially love Jesus. And he hesitates to use that word for sacrificial love to Jesus because he knows exactly what that means. And he knows that he failed before. And so he doesn't want to overpromise. And he doesn't compare himself to the other disciples. Even though Jesus had asked the question, do you love me more than these? In Peter's response, he doesn't mention the other disciples. He just says, you know I love you, Lord. I think Peter has made some real progress in his character, in his response, and his unwillingness to overpromise now to Jesus. Jesus says, tend my lambs, or feed my lambs. Now, that's of course figurative. Jesus had no literal lambs. What Jesus really means is, Peter, I want you to take care of my people. Now, I take to heart what Jesus is doing here. Jesus knows that he's going to be leaving his people, and he wants to leave them in the hands of those who will take care of them. And that's my desire as well. And I believe that's what Brian will do, that he will take care of you. Jesus asked Simon a second time, Simon, do you agapao me? Do you love me? And Peter says to him, yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you. Jesus said to him, shepherd my sheep. Now this word, the first word kind of focuses on feeding his sheep. This one focuses more on leading them. And then he said to him a third time, and this time Jesus uses Simon's word. He says, Simon, son of John, do you phileo me? Do you even phileo me? And Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you phileo me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I phileo you. And Jesus said to him, tend my sheep. So what is Jesus doing here in this conversation? What he's impressing upon Peter is that if Peter is going to take care of God's people, he has to sacrificially love Jesus. That has to be his motive. You see, that's the only motive that will really work in ministry. If you try to take care of God's people out of duty or obligation, you will become bitter and resentful, and you will burn out. If you try to take care of people out of some desire to build your own ego and because you need people to like you, you won't make the hard decisions that have to be made in ministry. If you try to lead God's people out of a sense of power and wanting influence and wanting to get your way, then you're going to lord it over God's people, and you're going to use people to achieve your own goals. And if you try to lead God's people out of love for money, well, you really chose the wrong career. Although there have been some unscrupulous people who have made millions off of God's people and in the process have discredited the gospel and the cause. The only motive that is really strong enough for you to shepherd God's people is a sacrificial love for Jesus Christ. You know, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 13, if you can do all things, but you don't have love, you're a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if you attempt things without love, you accomplish nothing. And if you give all your efforts and you have not love, it profits nothing. It is love for God's people and love for Jesus Christ that is the motive that will enable you to be the right kind of shepherd to his people. That's the first lesson in this passage. You need to love Jesus to take care of his sheep. The second lesson is you lose freedom when you serve Jesus. Now, sacrificial love means you're going to sacrifice something, and one of the things that you do sacrifice is you sacrifice freedom. You no longer can do everything you want to do if you're going to shepherd God's people. So in verses 18 through 19, Jesus says to Peter, "Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were younger, you used to gird yourself and walk wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will gird you and bring you where you do not wish to go." Now this he said, signifying by what kind of death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, "Follow me." Now, Jesus is describing Peter's life. And he says, Peter, before you knew me, when you were younger, you could do anything you wanted. You could go wherever you wanted, do whatever you wanted at any time. But now that you're following me and you're getting older, someone else is going to stretch out your hands and gird you and take you where you don't want to go. So he's describing a life before following Jesus of a lot of freedom, and a life after following Jesus of constraints upon that freedom. And of course, John explains to us that Jesus is primarily describing Peter's death. You stretch out your hands. That's a reference to crucifixion. And indeed, Peter, according to tradition, was crucified in AD 64. And crucifixion, death, obviously is the most severe restriction of freedom there is. But ministry requires the loss of freedom in order to do it. So, for example, when I made the decision to mentor at OG, what that meant was I could no longer go fishing during the school year. Those of you who have chosen to serve in the Sunday school or on the worship team have made sacrifices. You had to give up opportunities of things to do on the weekend because you had committed yourself to serving God's people on Sunday morning. Those of you who have children, you know that if you're going to shepherd your children, you have to make sacrifices, that there are things you can't do now with your having kids that you used to be able to do. Ministry requires sacrifice. Now, here's the truth that I also want to share with you. Although ministry does require you to sacrifice personal freedom, in turn, it gives you great fulfillment. When you serve God's people, you can know that you are investing in something that will last for eternity. You know that instead of serving your own personal interests and desires, that you're making a difference in people's lives and you're glorifying God and you're living a life that is full and significant and honorable and worthy. I can tell you that from personal experience, from my 23 years being here, that every sacrifice has been worth it because of the great satisfaction and fulfillment of coming to the end of my time and having a clear conscience before the Lord Jesus and knowing that I served to the best of my ability. And there is great joy and satisfaction in that. I'll tell you this, you will never get as much pleasure by serving your own self and holding on to all your freedom as you will by giving up some of that freedom to serve God and His people. You will always come out ahead in terms of joy and fulfillment and satisfaction if you sacrifice some of your freedom for the Lord Jesus Christ. That's the second thing that he's telling Peter here is, if you want to serve God's people, you have to be willing to give up some of your personal freedom and your rights in order to make a difference in people's lives. The third thing that he says to Peter is, don't compare yourself to the other shepherds. So in verses 20 through 23, Peter, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who had leaned back on his bosom at the supper and said, Lord, who is the one who betrays you? So Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, Lord, and what about this man? And Jesus said to him, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. Therefore this saying went out among the brethren that the disciple would not die, but Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but only, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? So Jesus had just told Peter, someone's going to spread your hands and they're going to take you where you don't want to go. And Peter turns around and sees John following them, and he says, well, what about John? What about him? Now, I can't know for sure Peter's motive in asking that question, but you can kind of infer from Jesus' response that Peter's motive wasn't quite noble, because Jesus basically says to Peter, mind your own business. If I wanted to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. This is one of the temptations in the Christian life, is to compare yourself to other people who are in ministry. So you compare yourself in terms of the opportunities that you receive versus the opportunities they receive. You compare yourself in terms of the apparent success you have with the apparent success they're having. You compare yourself in terms of the rewards and recognition you receive versus the rewards and recognition they receive. You even compare your kids to their kids. And this is a fool's game to compare yourself. Because the truth is, everyone is totally unique. No one else has the same combination of childhood, strengths and weaknesses, opportunities, friendships, health as anyone else does. So you see someone else who has a greater apparent ministry success than you do, and that leads you either into self-doubt and self-criticism or bitterness toward your people that they're not just as on fire as the other people in that church. Or you see yourself succeeding and some other person struggling in ministry, and you're tempted to take on for yourself your success and claim it as you're doing. Or you see someone else's kids and you say, well, why can't my kids be as good as their kids? Or vice versa, why can't their kids behave as well as my kids? And you do all this comparison, and it is poison to your soul, because you cannot accurately compare yourself to anyone else. God has you on a unique path that no one else is on, and you simply cannot know and cannot accurately compare yourself to anyone else. It is a fool's preoccupation. And so Jesus tells Peter, don't compare yourself to the other shepherds. You know, it would be great if when any of us, when we're tempted to compare ourselves to someone else, if Jesus would just whisper in our ear, what is that to you? You follow me. John goes on then and gives us a final explanation of the extent of Jesus' ministry. He says, verse 24 and 25, this is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And there were also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books that would be written. Well, that last verse is a bit of an exaggeration. That's called hyperbole. I'm sure that the earth is big enough that it could hold all the books that would describe Jesus' life. But John is making a point with his exaggeration. The point he's making is there's a lot of stuff about what Jesus did in his 3-year ministry that's not recorded in the Gospels. He probably did many more miracles than we're aware of. He certainly had many more interactions with people. He preached many more times and taught many more times than that's recorded in the Gospels. I don't imagine that Jesus said a lot of other things that we need to know that's not in the Gospels. I imagine what happened is that Jesus went from place to place and repeated himself over and over again, because he didn't have internet back in those days and there was no printed material. So he probably shared the same messages over and over again. But the point is well taken. We don't have everything that Jesus did. And what that means is that each gospel writer, through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, chose certain events and certain teachings to put in their gospel, because each gospel has a purpose behind it. And I'm not going to go into all detail of what those purposes might be today. But each gospel has a point of view and something that the gospel author is trying to emphasize about the life of Jesus. But one thing that is common to all 4 gospels, at the end of them, there is the theme, the idea that Jesus' disciples need to carry on the mission that Jesus started. So you see it here in this passage with Jesus having this conversation with Peter and telling him to tend his flock, to take care of his sheep. But in each of the Gospels, there's something to the effect that the disciples need to carry on the mission that Jesus started. And so that's the application that I want to leave with you today, to continue the mission that Jesus started. So when this church started, the people who started this church felt like this community needed another Bible teaching church. And that's why they started what is now Hope Fellowship. They were concerned that the Word of God be communicated accurately to both believers and non-believers. And they were concerned that it would be not just to adults, but to children and youth as well. That's one of the reasons they started Awana so early in the church's history, is that they were all about the faithful transmission of God's truth to their generation. So when I came here in 1996, that was the legacy handed to me, to faithfully transmit God's truth to this generation. And you and I together for 23 years have been about maintaining that legacy. And some of us, our time is coming to an end in our part of that legacy. For many of you, you still have many years here at the church to continue that legacy. And for some of you, you're just starting here and just getting exposed to that legacy. And that is what God has called us to do. We are in a train that goes all the way back to Jesus Christ and his first disciples. And that legacy and that train and that tradition of passing on God's truth to the next generation has been continued up till now. So, some of my final words to you are to take up the words of Jesus himself and give you that same challenge. Feed his lambs. Shepherd his sheep. Tend to his flock.